I do think that the right, yes. Good. So let us get started. So today I will begin with some general statements about our readings for today, and then we will open it up to a larger discussion of how this fits into our concerns with moral philosophy in a much more general sense. But to begin with some basic discussions of our text for today. First of all, as you know, we are still in what we are calling the third orientation of the class, and quickly to situate ourselves, to remind ourselves, we began with the first orientation. These attempts to claim, either based upon a radical argument of individuality, of the individual becoming divine, the claim being that is the basis on which we reject the social conventions into which we are born, things that could limit us as human beings. We then turn to the second part of this first orientation, claims of radical love, arguing that many of the huge projects of radical self-transformation, radical social transformation, came out of these claims of radical love. That there is that because of this divine essence within us that can be defined either as the individual or in terms of radical love, in this latter push, the argument is radically transform the world such that some kind of radical form of equality could be achieved. We then turn to the next body of materials, arguments that were very concerned, oftentimes very explicitly so, with rejecting the first orientation. If the first orientation to a significant degree can be characterized as philosophies of the will, philosophies in which you are encouraging humans with their will to transform the world around them, in the second orientation the argument was, this is inherently dangerous, and the goal is to reject the will. That the will, in fact, has led to the world in which we're living, led to a world of suffering in which we're living, and the goal is to transcend that world by destroying the self, destroying the will, transcending the will, and therefore creating a radically different world through precisely that rejection. We then have been discussing in this third orientation attempts to, in a sense, move past this debate about the will altogether and argue that on the contrary, the goal is to create a better world precisely by rethinking modes of human interaction. We began with the discussion of Confucianism, this argument that we and the world around us is inherently messy, and the key is how we construct a world out of that messiness and the ways in which we do so. We then turned to, last week, utilitarianism, which is, as we have argued, intriguingly enough, kind of taken for granted in the world we live in today as being the correct view, not that it's argued as such, but it's taken as default the correct view, and which everything is based upon, in utilitarianism I mean, in which everything is based upon a claim of utility. And as we noted, despite all the seemingly dramatic shifts in the political debates, how much of the debate itself is really relying upon utilitarian calculus. And we asked if we were comfortable with that. And we now turn to yet another push in this attempt to rethink social interactions to create a world in which humans could flourish together. And we're looking at a rather distinctive figure, but we're using him for a particular purpose because if you find some of his arguments rather, let's say, unique, he actually represents, I think, a very characteristic way of thinking. And so if you're not fully convinced by our figure today, it should hopefully open up some larger questions for all of us. The figure, of course, is Fourier. And let me say a few words about him, and then explain why we're bringing him to your attention, and then use that to propel our discussion. So Fourier, as you know, lived in the early part of the 19th century, late 18th, but early 19th century. His main work is after the French Revolution. And he, like many people coming after him, was concerned with radical social transformation. But his mode of doing so is intriguing, although again, minus some of the terminology we'll be using to describe him personally, a much more characteristic, I think, of standard ways of thinking than perhaps we would be comfortable admitting. So Fourier's basic argument is the following. He is very much coming out of an Enlightenment tradition. The Enlightenment, of course, held that we should do the same thing for society that figures like Newton had done for the natural world. So if Newton had successfully, from this point of view, figured out the rational laws that govern the natural world, we need to do the same for human society. Let us figure out the rational laws that ought to be governing humans, reorganize society according to those rational laws, and therefore create an enlightened society. Fourier, living after the French Revolution, which he saw as a failure, decided that the way to do this is to develop a social theory modeled precisely on what he saw as what worked in Newton. So what we need to do is, first of all, decide what is the motivating force of human beings. His answer, the passions. But of course, we seem to have lots of different passions. But actually, we really don't, because if you rationally analyze them, he argues, we have 12. And we need to perfectly define what those are and what the proper mode of interaction amongst them would be. And once we characterize those perfectly, then we can see how those passions could be properly gratified if they are understood rationally in terms of their interaction. Then we must recognize that there are, of course, some differences in personalities. But again, there aren't a lot, it turns out. Here, too, we can rationally reduce these to a set number of types. And there are a certain number of personalities which he will then classify for us, and he will figure them all out. And then he will say, given that we have these passions, and given that there are 12 of them, and we can figure out how to they should be rationally organized such that they could all be gratified, and given the personality types, then what we do is we organize the world into small communities, phalanges, he will call them, in which we will have a defined number of people with a defined number of personality types, in which everyone, because the organization will be so defined, can perfectly gratify all of their passions, thus leading to a world of perfect harmony. And once we do this, and we can do this immediately, he argues, we can do this in any kind of an existing social arrangement, because these are relatively small. Once we do this, then eventually we will transform all of human society to operate accordingly. By so doing, we will also transform much of the natural world, which has already been domesticated poorly by poor human decision-making, into the proper form of domestication that will allow for the satisfaction and gratification of our passions. And once we do that, we will create a perfectly utopian society in which all of us will be gratified, and the world will be perfectly set up for our gratification. That will be, for him, perfect harmony. Now, as I mentioned, going through some of the details, some of this might seem a little unconvincing, and you might wonder why in a class like this we're bringing it to your attention. Well, here's why. I suspect no one in this room would be terribly convinced by the specifics of Fourier's arguments, and I think Bart has done a beautiful job of laying out what those arguments are. But note, in the forms of argumentation he is giving, this is actually a very typical, I'll put it in a stronger form, I think perfectly typical mode by which we tend to do critiques. And what I mean by that is the following. If, as we noted last week, utilitarianism is basically the state of the art, de facto, in how we debate issues, so we tend to take utilitarian arguments for granted, and the Trump argument is always the one who can give the best utilitarian argument. If that's the case, Note that when we give criticisms of the world in which we're living and calls for social transformation, we tend to be, although we'll use very different terms, we all are basically coming out of Fourier, or that line of thinking. And let me explain what I mean by this. What is the standard ways that we will argue for social transformation? A standard way of doing it is the following. You will see Fourier in every one of the points I'm about to mention. Humans in the current world are unsatisfied. The reason they are unsatisfied is because there is some essential nature of human beings that is not being satisfied in the current social arrangement. Therefore, let us rearrange the social order such that that aspect of humans can properly be fulfilled or gratified. And once we do that, we will create a better, I'll go ahead and use the word, utopian society in which everyone will be gratified because the world will be so organized. In doing so, we are assuming, as Fourier does, absolutely, that there are a defined set of ways that we can define humans. There is a human nature with a defined set of parameters. He happens to call these passions. We'll use other terms, but basically, there is something we need that will make us happy. And then the question is not, how do we as humans grow? How should we alter ourselves? How can we break out of whatever it is that is so called to define us? Rather, the question is simply, how do we therefore gratify human nature given that it is X? And moreover, how do we allow humans, given who they already are, given the restricted number of personality types we have, to simply be themselves? And how do we create a social organization in which people can simply be themselves and be gratified? And then let's organize the world accordingly. That, I would argue, is a very typical mode of critique. If you're not happy with the utilitarian world we're currently existing in, then how do you critique it? You simply say, something about humans is not being fulfilled, and let's rethink the entire social organization such that it could be fulfilled. To make a strong statement, almost, I'm tempted to take out almost. We'll see if we can think of an exception, in which case we can happily pull out the almost. But I'll keep it in to momentarily make it slightly weaker. Almost every single ism that develops in the 19th and 20th centuries follows this mode of argumentation. It begins with a claim as to what is the nature of humans, how will that nature be properly gratified, and how do we build a perfect totalizing system in which people can so be gratified given who they are. The calls not, therefore, being for humans to change, grow, for an argument that humans, to go back to 2 weeks ago, are inherently messy. And the question is, what types of humans do we make ourselves out of in this messy world and this messy stuff that we're born with? The argument is, we already are something. We already have a distinct nature, a distinct personality type, and a distinct set of what Fourier would call passions, but it can also be said to be simply something that would make us happy. And how do we organize society accordingly? If that's the case, and I think it is the case for, again, at least almost every ism we can imagine, let us then note the inherent dangers, returning again to Fourier, who put this perhaps in a way that we would not find totally satisfying. But if it's the same mode of argumentation, we have to figure out then why we're not satisfied. Note, in all of these, beginning with Fourier, this has to assume that we already are something. We have a defined human nature that is not going to be changed. We have a set of definable needs that simply must be gratified and fulfilled for us to be happy, period. And we have a set, very defined number of personality types that each of us already fits. And then we simply must live in a society in which we can be who we already are with our needs fully gratified given human nature, period. And then the debates come down to, what is that key thing that's not being gratified? And can that be best found in, for example, liberalism, neoliberalism, socialism, communism, fascism, all of which you will note are arguing along basically the same lines. They're simply debating as to what this inherent human nature is and what this need is that must be gratified for us to be happy. We're all Fourierists, in other words. Now, if that's the case, let's return to Fourier. and see why we're not satisfied. And I'm taking for granted that probably no one was fully convinced by Fourier, but feel free to state if on the contrary you were. But assuming probably you were not, let's ask why. One possible critique of Fourier, which I would argue most social theorists of the past 2 centuries would give, but I personally think we should question, would be to simply say Fourier has it wrong in the sense that he didn't quite figure out why it is that we're unhappy. He didn't quite figure out what our unfulfilled passions really are. He didn't quite figure out what type of social arrangement would most fully meet our needs. He didn't completely define all the personality types. So I personally might not fit into one of his personality types, all of which would, of course, be a perfectly fine critique if you accept all of his premises. And if you accept all of his premises, then the question will be, OK, how then do I redefine human nature? How do I rethink these passions that are not being fulfilled in the current society that we must reorganize in order to be fulfilled? What are the personality types that must be acceptable within this harmonious society that we're going to build? If that's the critique, I would say it's a false critique, because you're accepting everything Fourier is giving us. And if you were really unconvinced by that mode of argumentation, note, you have to critique actually the basis of most forms of social critique that have been dominant in the past 2 centuries, which follow this exact same line of argument. And if you're going to critique those, it's not an easy task. Note, this would mean you would have to give up any kind of claim as to what human nature inherently is. You would have to give up any kind of predefined notion of what already exists in humans that is not being satisfied, that we therefore must organize society such that it can be satisfied. You must give up any claim that we can define who we already are according to set personality types and accept that maybe who we think we are is part of a world in which we have been a part of creating, but perhaps very passively, and all of that may be up for grabs. But if you do all of that, note, you are already out of the realm completely of most of the ways that social theory has been operating in the past 2 centuries. You are also, by definition, out of one of the most common way of making arguments in the contemporary world, which is utilitarianism. And then you are thrown into the depths of, at least among the possibilities, what we have been discussing for the earlier parts of this semester up until the past 2 weeks, all of which, as we've noted, force a very substantial questioning, challenging of most of our assumptions. So in short, what I would like to say is the following. If we're not fully convinced by the utilitarian arguments of last week, note, you have to question most of the ways that political discourse, the grounds on which most political discourse today operates and takes for granted. And if you're not fully comfortable with Fourier, again, not the specifics, but the overall mode of argument, note, you are also not comfortable then with the basic modes of social critique that have been dominant for 2 centuries. And then again, we're stuck with, at least as possibilities, everything else we have been discussing, all of which would fundamentally challenge most of the assumptions we today take for granted. So with that as a brief opening statement.
Michael, just
yes.
on that last point, let me ask you about a distinction. So you emphasize the way in which Fourier bases his proposals for the conduct of life and the organization of society on a substantive picture of human nature, taken, if not as the end point, at least as the starting point, because after all, part of his project is, in a sense, to change human nature, starting from how it is now. Yeah? But then one can imagine, can one not, 2 different kinds of objections. One kind of objection is the one that you emphasized in the last part of your remarks, which is an objection to this method of basing proposals on such a substantive conception of human nature. The other kind of objection is to accept in principle the method, but to argue that Fourier has presented us with a mistaken picture of human nature.
Absolutely. And most social theorists since Fourier would take that second option. I mean, most would accept the grounds of Fourier's argument and simply say exactly this. He got it wrong. That this isn't really the motivating passions that we need to be worried about. These aren't the reasons we're not gratified. This isn't the proper way to reorganize society
not just
such that we will
his
be.
list of temperaments and passions is inaccurate, but that his whole way of understanding desire is flawed. That would be a different kind of objection.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And presumably, in engaging a thinker like this, both kinds of objections are pertinent, and they may interact in a certain way.
Absolutely. And again, part of the question for all of us is exactly this. Are we comfortable with the mode of argumentation? Or if we're comfortable with the grounds and want to come up with a different vision of what makes us tick to base our social theory, then indeed, what would that be? Absolutely. So let's open this part up for discussion on Fourier and social projects in general, and then we will turn to the larger discussion, please.
So I have two things I'd like to say that are kind of generally addressing topics of the past 2 weeks that I just mentioned.
Great.
The first is that for another class, I was assigned Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals.
Yes.
And in his first essay, he provides a critique of what he calls slave morality, or slave religion. And in my view, he makes an argument for romanticism and aristocracy, good and bad, versus utilitarianism and egalitarianism,
Yes.
which is good and evil,
Yes.
in his mind.
Yes.
And I agree with Nietzsche in everything he says except for his adjectives. So I think that the triumph of what he calls slave morality is a rightful one, or egalitarianism is a rightful one. That said, last week was a critique of utilitarianism, which I think is entirely valid. Now, this is just kind of setting the stage for my actual comment, which is that, so I agree that we live in a mostly utilitarian world, and especially the world of, I guess, what some might call the liberal elite, or the people who govern our society, as kind of a, I don't know, lukewarm utilitarian / misunderstanding of Buddhism sort of world where, like, okay, you do your work here, and you try to be treated as well as you can, and then you take time off when you need it, because utilitarianism is actually not sustainable.
Exactly.
But you deny that by, taking a break from it now.
Right. Exactly.
Recently, I read a Penny Red article called "The Lost Boys of Milo Yiannopoulos," about these young men who follow Milo Yiannopoulos around the country on the various tours and talks he gives, and whose aim seems to be to disrupt the current, utilitarian order that governs or has governed the United States for many years. And that to me seems like a neo-romanticism,
Yes.
which is, nativist, nationalist,
Right.
and which has a big presence in the United States and in Europe.
Yes.
And it's this very disturbing, fiery sort of subculture
Yeah.
running around the U.S. and Europe.
Yes.
And so I can see how something like that might stem from the state of, like, the more dominant, or I guess the culture of the more dominant parts of society. So generally higher educated, wealthier people are on the side of utilitarianism and Fourier's idea, this sort of kind of like how in a lot of workspaces there's this idea that we can be defined based on, like, our Myers-Briggs personality type or something, and put into various communities and spaces based on our personality types.
Exactly.
And we work more effectively and are more satisfied because, we make our decisions based on whether we're introverted or extroverted.
Precisely.
Or this or that, and so on. And so I definitely see how utilitarianism and I guess Fourierism govern how we operate now.
Yeah.
But I'm, at the same time, it's it seems important to me to address this problem of the romantic
Yes.
subculture,
Yeah.
which stems from kind of, I think,
But can I interrupt you and ask you first just a clarification? You have equated Bentham and Fourier just now when you say utilitarianism and Fourierism. It seems that there's a vast difference in this respect, that Benthamism, taken now not in the sense of the school philosophy of meta-method, but in its project, is a radical altruism. Its principle is the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And therefore, in that sense, service to others. Fourier, by contrast, seems to be preoccupied with the fulfillment of desire. His philosophy is not the philosophy of a radical altruism. That is, he doesn't demand from the participants in his world that each of them be a radical altruist. He tries to organize a system in which the desires will be complementary. For example, the exhibitionist will be paired with a fetishist, and they'll make each other happy. Now, in that system, the only radical altruist seems to be the philosopher himself, who conceived the scheme. Because in conceiving it, he is not fulfilling any particular desire, other than the desire that Fourier introduced in his system, the 13th desire, which he calls unity. Exceptional, he attributes to the so-called originals, who are preoccupied with their relation to the rest of the world. So the only way in which we could square the circle and explain the motivations of the philosopher is by appealing to that 13th desire, which then elides the contrast between narcissism and altruism. So that's just a clarification about what seems to be the difference between Bentham and Fourier.
yes, I agree with that, but I also do see that contrast in, I don't know, in what I've described as people adopting both of these philosophies, because I think a lot of people in the United States, high-educated, generally well-off people, want to be altruistic and believe that they have a duty to the rest of humanity in making the world better, but then feel very guilty because their lives consist mainly of gratifying their own desires, you know. I mean,
But then why should they feel guilty? Then they don't have two philosophies. On your account, they only have one philosophy. They would have two philosophies if they believed that the pursuit of desire were legitimate and was somehow in tragic contradiction with the imperative of radical altruism.
right.
So different, I just didn't understand the term guilty in this context. Because guilty suggested that they really only believed in the legitimacy of radical altruism. They had a practice of pursuing their desires. And that practice could not be validated under their philosophy. That's different from the picture in which they have two contending moral visions, one of which is the legitimacy of the pursuit of desire, and these two visions conflict. That's a different characterization of the circumstance, right?
Yes, but I think that having conflicting visions can lead to guilt if you can't entirely fulfill one or the other.
So it's a different kind of guilt, and the guilt might go the other way. So if you devoted yourself to radical altruism, then on that modified account, you would also feel guilty.
Yes.
because you were sacrificing your desires. So then you're describing a contradiction in the dominant moral ideas.
Yes. Yes. I think there might be a contradiction in the dominant moral ideas. My question is kind of to step further, although I'm not sure that the contradiction here is settled enough to push forward. But my question is, how do we address the romantic subculture and the conflicting elements of these various...
Correct. So that's yet another thing, right?
Yes.
Distinct from altruism and from the pursuit of desire. So that's yet another element in the widely shared moral ideas.
Yes.
So later, and as a bridge to the discussion of the last 2 weeks, I want to present this proposal that I placed on the board of the topography of first-order moral projects in our moral ideas. And just for purposes of clarification, I've associated them with certain thinkers. But in practice, these ideas seem to be simultaneously held by the same people, by us, at the same time, so that our moral ideas are contradictory, and we are united not by uniformity in ideas, but by shared participation in the same contradictions. Once again, the principle enunciated by the narrator in Proust: we are friends with those whose ideas are at the same level of confusion as our own. Yes.
Well, I have a question for clarification. I was wondering what civilization and civilized really means for Fourier, because I know there's a footnote where it says Fourier believed himself to be at the axis of barbaric civilization and harmony. And I know a lot of the ideas in this piece are set against civilization.
Yes,
So
yes.
I just want to get a better grasp of that.
Yes. So basically, he's coming here very much out of Enlightenment terminology, that we use much the same terminology. And the argument is that civilization, as we currently define it, is an artificial construct. And it's artificial here in a negative sense. So artificial in the sense that it's been based upon all sorts of accreted ideas that have led to all sorts of institutions and forms of social hierarchy that are holding us back. And the way to build a proper world of harmony is to build a natural one. Now, again, natural is not the way we tend to use the word. What they mean, again, is they're looking at figures like Newton and to say, Newton figured out the natural laws that govern the natural world, and we need to do the same thing with humans. And so if we organize the world according to the proper rules that ought to guide humans, the proper rules of social interaction, in other words, again, working out what our passions are, how they could properly be interconnected, the distinct personality types and how they could be connected together, et cetera, and reorganize the world accordingly, that would be a world of harmony, which, as you said, he repeatedly puts in opposition to civilization, meaning civilization as it's currently understood.
So if I could just follow up on that, one way to understand the answer to the question you present is to evoke the figure of Sigmund Freud, who is in the same line, in this sense, of Fourier, Marcuse. Could put Freud in the middle. Remember that one of Freud's last writings was his little essay, Civilization and Its Discontents, which makes explicit his idea about the very problem that you raise. The central conception is that civilization is based on repression. And repression of what? Repression of our desires. That's the central idea. And in a sense, it's the central idea of Freud's whole system, as in Fourier. So insofar as Fourier is imagining a political transformation related to the development of humanity, he is imagining the order that would mitigate and minimize repression, a form of social life, if not entirely without repression, at least with the minimum possible of repression, exploiting, for example, the complementarity of the desires and frailties of different people. That seems to me to be the gist of an answer to your question. That's the distinction that Fourier is driving at. Civilization is repression, and therefore civilization is unhappiness. Let's then imagine a form of life in which, to the extent possible, we can do without repression. And to do that, we have to begin by understanding what we want. So that's Fourier's project. And in this project, he displays a degree of consistency that we in the common sense world take as a token of insanity, because common sense experience is not consistent. But Fourier follows to the hilt the logic of his own ideas and demonstrates a complete superiority to the common prejudices about what is too trivial for a great thinker to be concerned with. So, for example, there are all these sufferings that we can't escape, of disease and death. But our lives are besieged by petty forms of unhappiness. And Fourier explored them and listed them by the hundreds and tried to do something about them. So I'm going to give you an example, which is an extreme example. Fourier concluded that one of these thousands of forms of unhappiness is that people have trouble evaluating what melons are ripe enough and therefore sweet enough to eat. It seems too petty for a thinker to concern himself with, but nothing was too petty for Fourier. And he also judged that the common methods for assessing the ripeness of melons were inadequate. He then devoted a considerable amount of time to developing a way of assessing the ripeness of melons. Now, once again, an example of a radical altruism, which in his system would have no place, except for this 13th desire of altruism. And then we might wonder whether the 13th desire is not like the 13th chime of the clock, which not only startles us, but casts doubt on the previous 12 chimes. Yes?
So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to what I see as a bit of a problem with the communities where Fallings is upstairs. And I can see the logic in pairing the exhibitionist of fetishist, but it seems that Fourier is falling into this like very typical naturalistic fallacy, where in a sense he's going to put the wolves and the foxes and the lions in the same pen as the sheep and the chickens and the antelope. And I'm just kind of wondering how he dealt with that. Maybe I missed it in the reading, but how does he suppose that all these people, when you pair them up, might have complementary passions in a community of 720 or so? I would imagine there would be a little bit of conflict, to say the least.
Except his argument is the reason we have human conflict is because our passions are not being gratified. So if we can create worlds in which our passions are perfectly being gratified, then we wouldn't be the equivalent of wolves. We wouldn't be killing each other if our passions are being gratified. So the argument is figure out what all of our passions are, what the different personality types are, pair them all perfectly so they can interconnect perfectly, and then you wouldn't have the equivalent of wolves. We wouldn't be killing each other because all of our passions would be fully gratified.
But that assumes that if you've got an exhibitionist, you don't also have someone who completely abhors the idea that there might be an exhibitionist living within 100 feet of them. That's a pretty facetious example, but I'd imagine there are very much stronger examples.
But yeah, well, but even sticking with that example, which I actually think is a good one, so the argument he would make is to say, but that person who would be against exhibitionists is only against exhibitionists because they're not being gratified in whatever passion they have, and therefore they're taking it out on others. So the claim is, if we can perfectly gratify all of our passions, then these problems wouldn't occur. Now again, I mean,
As in Freud.
I was going to say, I mean,
that the vengeful moral ideas
precisely.
are a manifestation of the moral psychology of repression.
I mean, keep in mind, again, I mean, I think most of us would find Fourier's specific ideas here a bit loony, but keep in mind, this is the mode of argumentation of most utopian thinkers. They will define what it is we need to gratify differently, obviously, but getting back to the heart of your question, they would tend to say you would not have things like violence, crime, et cetera, if people could be gratified in the following way. So it always comes down to the argument that the reason these things exist in society is because at some level people are not being gratified, and if we can gratify them, they will all disappear. As opposed to a view that would say, well, again, going back 3 weeks, we're just inherently messy creatures, and we do have these ugly sides as well as different sides, and it depends what sort of a world you build that builds on different sides of us. But this argument is, no. What we're defining as the bad things simply as a result of our passions not being gratified. Again, I share your skepticism with Fourier, but I would again note it's a very common move from so many social theorists. Yes, please.
I actually have 2 questions. My first question is, who in Fourier's system is supposed to be the organizer?
Him. So, and not necessarily only him, but he would argue he's the equivalent of a Newton. So in this reading, Newton didn't do anything with the natural world. Newton was simply the first one who rationally figured out what the natural laws are. And so he would claim he's simply doing the same. So it doesn't have to be him. It could be anyone rationally looking at what makes humans tick, what motivates human beings, and he thinks he's right. So anyone, he would argue, would come up with the same system. He happens to be the Newton who first took the time to empirically work out what these natural laws are.
So my second question then is exactly how this is different from utilitarianism.
Yes.
Because in utilitarianism, you strive to maximize happiness for the most.
Right.
And this seems to be doing the same thing, except that it's more critiqued so that, it might not be one big thing that makes everybody happy. It's going to break it down into 12 different little things that, for some reason, 12 different personality types are the number, that they will all be met.
Yes.
But it, in an overarching way, seems to be doing the same thing. I mean, isn't it maximum?
No,
Yeah,
but
they're
there's
arguing-
a difference.
Oh, go ahead.
But there's a difference in the method. The Bentham's proposal is that each individual should seek the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Radical altruism. That's not Fourier's proposal. Fourier's proposal is that we organize a form of life in which each individual can simply fulfill his desire. It's only the organizers or the theoreticians of this system who would have to be the altruists, not the participants. And that's a fundamental difference in the moral attitude.
And let me just build on that by noting, and these figures, of course, are rough contemporaries. These are all part of the same project of trying to say, how do we rationally understand what makes humans tick, and how do we build a more rational society than the current society we're living in? But as Professor Unger said, in this case, utilitarianism and Fourier, they're going about it from sort of the perfect opposite positions. But intriguingly, they both want to claim it's going to lead to something pretty comparable in the sense of a rational society in which everyone will be happier. Exactly. In the former case, the idea is we rationally work out what will lead to the most happiness for the most people. And if we systematically do that for every decision, we'll organize the world as being a world where everyone will maximize their happiness. Fourier's move, on the contrary, is to say, well, let's begin by creating a world in which everyone's passions can be perfectly gratified, and that world will be a world of perfect harmony because everyone will react perfectly. So they will end in, yeah, go ahead.
Except that there was a different moral psychology suggested by the dedication to the book that I cited the other day. Bentham believed that the way to be happy is to try to make other people happy.
Yes.
Fourier didn't believe that. Fourier believed that essentially the way to be happy is to have your desires fulfilled. No repression, to the extent possible. That's a different prescription for the conduct of life, in which, of course, Bentham is incomparably closer to Christianity than Fourier is.
Although I would say I do think they're flip sides of the same coin, because utilitarianism, when you work out its implications, tends to lead to the same thing. I mean, this, of course, was the critique Mencius gave of the utilitarians of his own day, which was to say, well, the overt claim is it's all, you are sacrificing yourself for the better whole. But as Mencius said, well, if you work out the logic of this, the argument always is, and if you do so, you'll live in a better society, so it's in your best interest to live in a world where everyone's best interest is being fulfilled. And so as Mencius says, underlying even a straight utilitarian argument is a very narcissistic perspective. It's all about my personal profit, my personal interest. It's just Fourier is more open about that, whereas Bentham is going to say, oh, no, it's all about self-sacrifice. But the reason you do it is it's in my interest to sacrifice myself for the best interest of everyone. And then I know the end result will be a world of everyone's interest being fulfilled.
Yes,
so.
except on that view, even the discourse of Christianity, you could restate in,
Nietzsche
in the
does.
language of self-interest. So that's the elasticity of these discourses. If my self-interest is to win eternal life, if my self-interest is eternal beatitude, then even the most sacrificial orientation in life could be redescribed in the language of self-interest. So, but that makes these discourses too elastic to capture their distinction.
Although Mencius's critique isn't that. Mencius's critique is to say any philosophy based upon interest is going to play that same game. So his point isn't to say let's use a word that can capture different philosophies. His point is, if you base a philosophy on interest, if it's self-interest or the interest of the whole, the wrong point is that opening move of basing it on a notion of interest.
Except
so
that I don't
critique
know
is
that in
they both fail.
utilitarianism the key concept is interest. The key concept is happiness.
Depends on the utilitarian.
Yeah. But
A lot of interest-based
taking,
utilitarians.
not taking present-day utilitarianism and welfare economics and as a theory of materialistic individualism, taking Bentham himself and classical utilitarianism. Yes?
So I was just, because my understanding of Bentham is exactly that you can, the greatest good for the greatest number is arrived at by summing up these utiles that can be ranked from one thing to another.
Absolutely.
And so that mirrors
That's what the economists and the welfare economists and the reformers did with Benthamism.
Precisely.
But I don't think that was Bentham. So
well, but it follows. I would agree. I think it follows logically.
Yes.
If you want to put in place Bentham, that's what you have to do. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that's what it means to put Bentham into practice. Yeah. Yes, please.
I had a question about the idea that utilitarianism is self-interested.
Yeah.
So I think I followed your argument if so like a strict utilitarian follower, if they didn't die, then like their self-interest would be that the society is the best it can be. But I think if you're like a true ardent utilitarian and you're like, if I die, that will maximize happiness, you would choose to die. And then I don't see how that's self-interested, because maybe you're making society better, but you no longer get to take part in society.
Yes, but the key critique, so when Mencius is making this critique, he would say the danger is if you base interest as being your criterion, period. and Mencius was critiquing people who overtly put the interest solely in terms of others. So it was all about self-sacrificing oneself for others. And your point would hold perfectly for the philosophies in terms of what they were actually saying. But the Mencius' critique, of course, is to say this really only works because you're getting people to think in terms of interest. And if you're getting people to think in terms of themselves as interest-seeking creatures, in the long run, what's really going to be motivating that decision is self-interest. Now, in this case, to stick with your example, the self-interest would be you're convincing people that it's in my self-interest that society as a whole is well-functioning, so I would sacrifice myself. But your motivation is still claimed to be one of interest. Now, I should back up to explain the reason for this critique. So Mencius' critique, as we discussed 2 weeks ago, was based upon this Confucian notion that we tend to fall into habits and patterns in our behavior that will define us. And so his point would be to say, it's not that a utilitarian world couldn't exist. His fear was you could. You could create a perfectly utilitarian world where people would slowly fall into, to use his terms, the habits and patterns of thinking in terms of interest. And even if overtly it's in terms of the interest of others, the motivation is always, it's in my interest to think of the interest of others. And he would say, either way, you're going to create a series of very, very self-interested people claiming to be acting in terms of the greater whole. It goes back to the earlier question, too. And so Mencius' critique is any philosophy based upon interest moves you down a very, very dangerous path. Yes, please.
Mill does mention mass suicide, does he not? He says that he references other thinkers who say that if it gets bad enough, mass suicide is your best option.
What's mass, I suppose?
Sorry?
What is mass suicide?
Everyone killing themselves, or sometimes killing yourself is your best option in terms of finding happiness. I don't have the book with me, but he seems to mention it ironically. And that was the earlier question, right? Is that eventually, if you feel that you can't achieve happiness in your life or with anything you could do in your life, then it's best to depart. I'm sorry,
Could I just have a point
No,
of information? Since this is on the news so much, I have to bring it up. We have suicide bombers, right? And they usually have something in mind why they're sacrificing their own life and also the lives of many other people to accomplish some kind of utopian goal. Can you just address just comment a little about how they fit into this conversation? They have to fit in, so maybe you could give a comment.
Yes. I don't actually, I'm trying to think if I can think of an exception here, too.
For example, what
Yeah.
happened in St. Petersburg? This is a Western country. This was done by a Russian citizen. He blew up. Why? So, but did he feel that he would be happy if he, followed through on his plan? I don't see where killing other people is helpful at all.
Yes, I doubt there have been many, and probably none, who would ever phrase that in terms of any kind of an interest talk, whether that be a utilitarian interest level or a Fourier personal gratification. It's virtually always going to be put in terms of breaking down an existing world of oppression and trying to create a radically different world. And I almost never, in fact, never to my knowledge, has it ever been put in terms of an interest level talk. Yeah, either, again, interest of the larger majority or interest of myself. Yep. Tons of hands? Yes, please.
Just on that, isn't there often some conception of an interest in a reward in an afterlife? Whether that be a crusader, a Christian crusader dying on crusade, gets automatic passes into heaven, or, in reports of the people who committed the 9/11 attacks, getting, I don't know the details, but, I think in a lot of these cases, isn't there some sort of promise of an eternal reward? So that creates this sort of self-interest aspect to it.
Right.
I don't know,
I don't mind if kills himself to get to heaven, but why does he take out other people that may not want to be part of his plan? They didn't have any choice. They were just blown up. This I don't think is right. So that's the question if we're dealing in ethics here in this class. It's not a
Yeah.
decision. That's all. Take your own life, but don't take other people that don't even know why you're doing it. They don't even know you. So, it's very dangerous to deal with this kind of philosophy.
But yeah, let me answer this by way of the early response too. So yes, so when acts like this could be phrased in terms of self-interest, it's telling what a strong pushback there tends to be. Just to give you an example from an earlier tradition we were looking at. So when, as sort of one of the standard examples they will often make, in Buddhism, if you claim, if you even fall into a language that could imply you are claiming that you are achieving nirvana for yourself, the argument is by definition you won't achieve it because, of course, the goal is to overcome the self. And so anything that could even be remotely interpreted as self-interest by definition proves that you haven't learned it. You're not really doing it. And so, yes, if it could be phrased in terms of self-interest, that would automatically be seen as a lesser act, automatically. Yes.
So,
Which again is, oh, please, go ahead.
what, first,
I was just going to say, it seems like Mencius's criticism or critique about utilitarianism or the other forms, like when it's
Right.
talking about self-interest, isn't really so much a critique, because I think you could find self-interest in every single action. For instance, suicide bombing,
Yeah.
you might say there's self-interest in trying to go to heaven, or like taking this class, like there's self-interest to like learn something, you know, like there's always something underlying it, and so I don't really see it as even much of a critique because I think what utilitarianism would be is, or at least the like selflessness is kind of like a definition we give to a bunch of self-interested people acting in a way that benefits others as well as themselves, and that's kind of just the definition we give. So it's not like it takes away from selflessness or anything.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I think that the language of interest is so elastic that risks being vacuous, and that the best way to understand these thinkers that we're now discussing, Bentham and Fourier, is not in the language of interest or self-interest. There is a distinction, as I've argued, a profound distinction between the impulse to radical altruism and the impulse to overcome repression and to focus life on the fulfillment of desire. But the language of interest or the distinction between self-interest and other people's interests fails adequately to capture that distinction, because all these views can be stated in the language of interest, and the language of interest can be amplified to such an extent that it ceases to be restrictive. Now, I'd like to make some remarks in particular about Fourier, and then later in the class to place Fourier in a broader context, which would be a bridge to next week's discussion. But first Fourier, and I make two sets of comments. First about his method with respect to human nature as a guide, and with respect to the transformability of human nature. And then with respect to the content of his view of human nature. What I want to say about the method is mainly in support of the method, because I believe that Fourier's approach methodologically to the problem of human nature illustrates a direction that we should take, but that the content of his view of human nature is defective. So then, first the method. We discussed in an earlier class the limitations of the premise of classical political philosophy in its radical distinction between the good and the right. So an idea of classical liberal political theory is that the institutional order or the legal order should be neutral among substantive conceptions of the good. And the objection is that no institutional order can be neutral. Every institutional order tilts the scales, encouraging some forms of human experience and discouraging others. Nevertheless, the illusory and dangerous goal of neutrality has a kinship to a legitimate goal. The legitimate goal is the goal of developing a form of social life that accommodates a wide range of diversity and of contradiction, and that is corrigible in the light of experience. It can be challenged and changed. That's not neutrality, but it's something that bears a relation to the false idea of neutrality. The idea of neutrality, when it is invoked, invariably serves to entrench, in the name of neutrality, a sectarian vision of the good. Now we come to this problem in thinking about human nature in relation to moral life and to politics, a problem that concerned all of these thinkers. We cannot separate the attributes of human nature into two classes. One class would be the eternal and universal attributes of humanity, and the other would be the contingent and local or historically situated attributes. We can't do that. We can't do that because everything in our experience, even the most intimate sentiments, is colored by the transformation, the historical transformation of society and of culture. In that sense, we are on the line in history. Everything is on the line. There isn't a part that we can say is exempt from the dangers of history. Whatever we try and place in this category of the exempt from history will either be falsely exempt, it won't be true that it's not colored, or it will be so thin, this minimum common denominator, they will have no real content. It will be a series of empty labels or slogans. On the other hand, it's also not true that we are a malleable clay, that we can transform at will. All of these moral and political conceptions that we discuss are self-fulfilling prophecies. Each of them tells us, act as if I were true, and you will make the world more like what I say it is. But they're not completely self-fulfilling prophecies because the facts fight back. And the most important facts that fight back are the facts about us, what we're like now. We are recalcitrant to transformation. So both things are true, that everything in our experience is on the line or up for grabs or vulnerable to being colored and reshaped by history, but that we are recalcitrant to this transformation, and we are transformed only slowly and at the margin. So the practical consequence is that in choosing to pursue a certain direction in the organization of society, we choose, in effect, to develop our humanity in a direction. But we choose against the pressure of this recalcitrance of what we are like now to change. So what is human nature? Human nature is what we are like now. And how far can we go in changing it? We don't know. We have no a priori basis for knowing how far we can change it. All we know is that it's very hard to change it, and that it changes only in small moves. Now, that is the premise of Fourier. And if I am characterizing it correctly in its method, I want to argue that it's the correct premise. That's the role that human nature should have in our thinking. Now we come to the question of the substance of Fourier's picture. And Fourier's picture is related to this major tradition in the West, very influenced by Christianity, which we could bring under the label of the picture of the self, of the person as embodied spirit. It's part of this dialectic of immanence and transcendence. We are shaped in context, and we are present in a mortal, dying organism from which we cannot separate ourselves. Our individuality goes all the way down. But we have an infinitude within us, an unlimited depth. So in this sense, the infinite caught in the finite. Now, Fourier's substantive picture of humanity emphasizes certain aspects of this picture of embodied spirit that had been underemphasized in this tradition. The first aspect that it emphasizes is the significance of our embodiment. So one of the ways in which we are situated or contextual is that we exist as these organisms that have their desires, their impulses. The fulfillment of the desires is physically expressed. It has a physical reality. The second emphasis that Fourier gives is the emphasis on vitality, on life. And life is an expression of this transcendence. Desire has multiple forms. Desire is roaming. Desire is capable of surprising. Desire is spontaneous. Desire always has a surplus over what exists. And this is a powerful element in Fourier's picture of humanity. Then comes the third emphasis. The third emphasis is the suspicion of society, of every social order. Every existing social order is associated with repression, with the repression of desire, what we were just speaking about a moment ago. And the repression of desire is the suppression of our humanity on this view. So this is, so to speak, on the positive side. This is a powerful evocation of what we are like. But then we have to question the adequacy or the completeness of this view that he has of his main subject matter, which is desire. Does he characterize adequately these desires? So you could say in opposition to his picture, first, that he often seems to represent the desires of human beings as if they were the so-called instincts of animals, of non-human animals. as having a scripted or fixed quality. And we know that we're not like that. Our desires are, as I remarked in an earlier class, mimetic. We desire what the others desire, and our desires are projected. We never just want something in particular. We also want things, what goes beyond the particular. We want the unconditional, the absolute, the infinite, and we project it onto the particular. And this paradoxical relation of the object of desire and the ultimate horizon of our longing is manifest in the paradoxes of obsession or addiction, in which we desire intensely some paltry object, which functions as if it were a stand-in for something else. So behind this inadequacy of the picture of desire, or as its most dramatic focal point, is what we desire from one another. We don't desire from one another just the fulfillment of some particular fetish, some limited aim. We desire from one another an assurance that each of us has an unconditional place in the world. We desire from the other more than the other can ever completely give us. And as a result, we are ambivalent to the others and to ourselves. And Fourier's picture of desire, because of its animal-like character, fails to evoke this complexity of desire. So then you could generalize this objection and say that it arises from an inadequate recognition of the element of transcendence. And that's what makes it animal-like. Fourier recognizes our immanence, the full force of our embodiment, our central life. But he seems to shortchange the impulse of transcendence, that we spill over, that we exceed. And that's why desire for us has this relatively empty and roaming quality. And then finally, Fourier's account of desire or of our humanity seems to be defective because it doesn't do justice to the way in which the experience of desire for us is modified or shaped by being lived under the shadow of our mortality and of our groundlessness. Unlike the other animals, we know that we will die. And we struggle with the dreamlike character of human existence, that we don't know what the framework is unless we accept some revealed truth or adhere to one of the philosophical systems that claim to dispel the enigma of existence. And this combination of our mortality and of our groundlessness shifts the whole character of desire for us. Because it takes place under this shadow. And it therefore has an urgency, an element of contradiction or anxiety, an element of questing and of enigma that is not just about repression. It's about our fundamental situation in the world. So that then is an argument to say that Fourier's picture of the life of desire is flawed. It's a misrepresentation of of what we're like, that elides the difference between us and the non-human animals, and is therefore an inadequate basis for our moral and political orientation. So that's just what I wanted to say by way of suggesting a different vocabulary in which to engage Fourier, which is not the vocabulary of interest. It's the vocabulary of the validity of his substantive picture of human nature. Yes?
Very uncomfortable with a distinction you're making between the human and the other animals.
I know.
We're animals. If you have the capacity as a human to conceive of all of your logical statements,
Yes.
this is within the realm of the species of the human to be able to do this.
Yes.
So we are
We're natural beings.
but we are very creative.
Yes.
We're still governed by our own species, our own genetics. We have our own limitations,
Yes.
just like every other animal.
Yes.
We may be able to perceive our own death, but maybe the other animals do also, and maybe they don't need to. Maybe they don't need to have the headache of all of this theoretical stuff while on the ground people are dying and we can't do anything about it.
Yes, but what the old animal ethology described under the label instinct is the scripted character of desire in the evolutionary world. That desire, for the most part, is fixed and automatic, and it runs on certain algorithms or formulas. It is repetitious. And what this objection is emphasizing is the indefinition, the relative indefinition or emptiness of human desires. So it may be that for the purpose of the argument, I'm radicalizing or exaggerating this contrast, but that is the nature of the contrast that I'm drawing attention to, and it has to do with this central attribute of transcendence. So, because simplify the picture, and in relation to Fourier's prescription for the reorganization of society. His picture is we're like the bees or the ants or whatever. We have a list of 26 desires. So that's what we want. So what does he say? Give them what they want, and then they'll be happy. But we're not so simple, because we don't want just these 26 things. Those 26 things are, in a sense, just the stand-ins, the proxies for these much more indefinite longings that we have. That's the issue. That's the central issue that is being raised in this polemic of mine about Fourier's picture. Yes. Yes.
Which looks at body as a source of intelligence. And I was wondering what role rationality might have to play in this. And I was also intrigued by your idea of, how...
No, but I'm not sure I followed that. So restate that idea. So are you speaking about the relation between mind and brain, or what is...
Yes, so mind and brain, but also the fact that, this idea of animal-like instinct has something to do with looking at the body as more animalistic as compared to maybe a source of intelligence in some sense.
Yeah. This is another but related discussion, right? So I think the beginning of any honest answer that deals with the issue of mind and brain and their connection is we don't know, right? But take a characteristic problem, which is the relation between the work of the imagination and a physical attribute of the brain, which is described as its plasticity. So, in some respects, the brain is like a machine. It's modular and formulaic, and there are specific functions that are associated with different parts of the brain. So if a certain part of the brain is damaged, those functions will be harmed. On the other hand, the brain is not completely modular, and it displays physically this attribute of plasticity, which is that the functions can be to some extent rearranged and taken over by other parts of the physical structure of the brain. So that's the physical discussion of plasticity. Now we come to the discussion of the imagination. On one account, the two crucial moves of the imagination are distancing and transformation. So the imagination works by distancing itself from the phenomenon. The phenomenon is remembered or represented rather than just perceived. The image is the memory of a perception. And then the imagination proceeds by representing a series of possible transformations of the phenomenon. That's how we understand the state of affairs, by grasping its transformative possibilities along the periphery of the adjacent possible, what it could become next. Now, then you could ask, what's the relation between the work of the imagination, this anti-machine side of the mind, and the physical attribute of plasticity? You could say that the plasticity of the brain is one of the enabling conditions of imagination. So the brain is so organized that it can be the seat of a mind that has these imaginative capabilities. Nevertheless, we don't understand the bridge. There's no comprehension that we have in detail of the passage from the brain with these attributes, such as plasticity, to the mind that has the power of imagination. So we don't know, but what we can say is that imagination is the mental expression of this attribute of transcendence. That we're not just scripted, we're not just a bunch of formulas and repetitions and algorithms. The mind can defy its own methods and presuppositions and discover something that can only be made sense of after the fact. That is, it can, after its discoveries, develop the methods and presuppositions and make sense of them. And that's a being with that kind of a mind is the same being that has these roaming, relatively unscripted desires. That kind of a being is not an automaton. And in that sense, not like one of the creatures described by Fourier in his system.
But are we all not seeking some kind of transcendence the moment we're disconnecting brain and the mind to seek that something that is higher than the brain, which leads us to be maybe in some sense higher than who we are, and in some sense also leading to the idea of not necessarily self-deification, but at least rejection of the immediate.
So what's the question, or what's the proposal?
I'm just wondering whether we really need to disconnect the mind from the brain.
Whether?
We need to disconnect the mind from the brain in order to, because that in itself is some form of transcendence.
Yes, but it would be, so my view, maybe there are other people here who have different views, is my view is we know very little about this subject matter. I'm simply defending a minimalist position, which is that we not have a view of the mind or of its relation to the brain that contradicts our powers of imagination, or in general, our transcendence. Yes?
This is a key point. You're stating you're unhappy with the idea of a scripted behavior, and that we don't know, and you're correct, we don't know really the whole picture. Someday we'll know a lot.
Yes.
But the problem is, to say that, you also have to admit that we also know very little about the other animals that Fourier might have mentioned. He certainly didn't know anything about animal behavior compared to what we know. But you can't discount it or animals because you don't know the other animals.
But this is secondary, right? I mean, if it turns out that the other animals have aspects of this experience of indefinition, that changes nothing in the argument for this purpose. It's the opposite. It's the inverse problem that concerns me. That if we presuppose a view of animal life as scripted, animal desire as scripted, and then reduce our picture of our own desires to that picture, then we get something like Fourier's view. That's wrong.
Okay.
Yes, that's right. So, but nothing in this argument depends on the extent to which the divide between our transcendence and our indefinition and the experience of the animals, the non-human animals, is less absolute. So the whole argument here is, the gist of the argument is that Fourier is radically understating the degree of transcendence. And therefore, the roaming character of desire, its emptiness, and that in this world in which both the fetishists and the exhibitionists would get everything that they want, they wouldn't, in the end, all live happily ever after, because that's not what human beings are like. That's the argument. And I then dramatize it with respect to what we want from each other. We want the combination of independence and reconciliation. We want an assurance that there's a place for us in the world. We just don't want a combination of A, B, and C. It's not a series of bilateral executory promises with an instantaneous performance. I'll give you what you want, and then the deal is settled. That's not what it's like. And it seems that in Fourier's picture, it is what it's like. Yes?
Well, I have a question. For me, it seems like the underlying question is the distinction between necessity and desire, as in, like, what do we really need from a physical point of view, like, I think, food, shelter?
Yes.
And that if any sort of institution were to be made or form of society, would be to fulfill those necessities and not the desires. And for me, in Fourier's point of view, desire is almost a necessity.
Yes, but Fourier himself discusses this, right? Need and desire, and so he takes the position that civilization attends to our needs, what you call our necessities, and uses that as an excuse to repress our desires. So we must attend to our needs, on Fourier's proposal, but in a way that would not repress our desires.
I'm compelled by your argument against Fourier. I like it a lot. I think the one place that I think maybe it doesn't go far enough is in the critique of the methodology. I think there's in your critique still an assumption that impulse matters. Even an impulse for transcendence, that the fulfillment of impulse is somehow necessary to us creating a philosophy around it.
So I'm making these methodological claims, and tell me if you disagree with them. So it's a combination of three sets of ideas. One idea is that in any moral or political conception, in any program of how to live or how to organize society. We need to make assumptions about who we are. So in that sense, we need to rely on a view of human nature. The second idea is that there is no permanent and universal form of human nature. In other words, that we can't factor out a set of thickly defined attributes that are not susceptible to historical transformation. That's the argument about saying that in choosing a direction of social reconstruction, we choose to develop ourselves in a certain direction. The third idea is that we are not readily malleable, so that any proposal for moral and political reconstruction that depends on a sudden and radical transformation of what we are like now is a bad proposal. It's a bad utopianism. And it will result in something very different from what it claims to result in. Those three ideas seem to be all simultaneously true. And so I'm simply defining a loose set of constraints on the role of the conception of human nature in a moral and political argument. It's not a particular proposal about human nature. It's just the definition of the conceptual space in which the idea of human nature would have a legitimate role in these moral and political arguments. But actually, although these three constraints seem to be very loose, they exclude a huge proportion of the thinking that has actually taken place in moral and political thought. So they're not empty. They are constraints that have a force.
But wouldn't they still assume a particular ontological framework?
Well, I'm not sure. So then it depends on the substantive conception of human nature. So that's a different argument. So that then would come to the second part of remarks. As in my criticisms of Fourier's substantive conception, that is, I argued with him there on the substance of his view of what we are like now. And maybe that's what you're calling ontological. But that's what I would call simply the substantive view. And I'm claiming there that despite the general correctness of his method about the role that an idea of human nature plays in moral and political argument, his substantive picture of who we are is flawed. That was the argument that I was making.
I think maybe I'm seeing the substantive picture that you're painting as still not basic enough. Like it's still when we say embodiment and vitality and suspicion of society, that's still sort
of course, I
tier.
wasn't presenting a detailed substantive picture, right? I was just marking where I think the problems lie in Fourier's picture. And in general, all of my complaints have a common element, which is the one that you pointed to in the tracing of the lines between the human and the non-human. It's this issue of transcendence, of indefinition, if you like, of the infinitude of the human being. Now, I don't know, should we go on to this last thing as a bridge to next week?
Sure.
What do you think? There's not going to be time to do this, but I think this is to set up a discussion for next week and for our last class. We only have 2 classes left. First, let me begin here. So here on the left side of the board is what the course has not been about. But it has been mentioned from time to time, because what's here on the left side of the board is the almost totality of what passes for moral philosophy in the Anglo-American Academy. So let's call it the school philosophy. And it's not about the conduct of life. It's about these meta ideas. That's the method of moral philosophy. The substantive implication for the conduct of life is obscure. And in this school philosophy, there are three positions that are treated as the canonical positions. Utilitarianism, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, the philosophic calculus. Kantianism, especially the Kant of the second critique, the critique of practical reason, the categorical imperative, and social contract. And then a great deal of this academic moral philosophy, the meta-philosophy, is a contest among these three conceptions. Recently, there was published a work that I have mentioned by Derek Parfit, an English moral philosopher, on what matters, in 2 volumes, published in 2011. And the central concern of this philosopher is with the problem of the objectivity of moral ideas, the struggle against relativism or skepticism. So the argument in this work is that these three meta-moral conceptions are equivalent. Parfit seeks to demonstrate that their claims can be translated into one another. And he takes this equivalence as testimony of the objectivity of moral ideas, of the existence of moral truths. There are truths in morals as there are truths in mathematics. That's how he interprets the significance of the equivalence that he demonstrates. Now, without further argument, I simply want to state the following position that we might or might not discuss in the course of our last 2 classes. His view of their equivalence is correct. They are equivalent. They're all elastic vocabularies, and what they say, what is said in one vocabulary, can readily be translated into any of the other 2 vocabularies. But the interpretation of the significance of the equivalence is not correct. There is another, much simpler and more parsimonious interpretation, which is that they're equivalent because they're empty. That's why they're equivalent. And their equivalence is not an indication of moral objectivity. It's an indication of moral emptiness. They have no clear first-order consequences for the conduct of life or for the organization of society. Now, I say nothing more about that for the moment, because in those, yes.
You call it Anglo-American.
Yes.
That's not there's no American in that. It's all European.
No.
Kantian is German.
No.
Social contract is French.
But there's a misunderstanding. Actually, this view of the agenda of moral philosophy was mainly developed in the United States. The theoreticians who are viewed as the inspirers or the originators were all Europeans.
Right.
But the view that moral philosophy consists in these 3 positions is an American view. It's the view which was made hegemonic in the American Academy and now received in Europe. The Europeans didn't think that way. Now, for the most part, they think that way, at least in Britain. in large part because of American influence.
Where would William James pragmatism fit?
It doesn't fit here.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't fit here. And it's not one of these canonical moral positions. And of course, there are many positions outside, because that view is not just a meta view. That is a view that has a first-order proposals.
Right.
These views have no first-order proposals. Now we come to the central part of the chart, which is put aside the meta-ethical dispute and focus on the genealogy of ideas in the central tradition of Western thought, of Western philosophy, Western thinking about the conduct of life. Now, only at the beginning of the chart does it include India, but in the rest of the chart, it's just about the West. So it's not a world historical chart, but it nevertheless includes a great deal. Now, it begins here with what has been described as the central paradigm, the model of moral thinking, widely disseminated in the ancient civilizations, Indo-European. And a classic statement of this view is by the French comparativist, linguistic and social theorist Georges Dumézil. So the view is that there was a powerful paradigm which was articulated in Europe and in ancient India, and represented, for example, in the philosophy of Plato. In the soul, there is a hierarchy of dispositions or impulses. The highest impulses are the impulses of reason or spirit. Then below them are the action-oriented impulses. For example, courage or vitality. And then the lowest are the sensual appetites, equivalent to the animal instincts. And for there to be order in the soul, this hierarchy has to be respected. Reason has to command the action-oriented impulses, and they in turn have to command the appetites. Now, how is this hierarchy to be established? To the extent that it is established, the human being can be guided by objective reality or objective value. There is a cosmic order. For example, there are archetypes of the true. But we cannot perceive them to the extent that our experience is disturbed and guided by the sensual appetites, only if reason is in command. The indispensable bridge between hierarchy in the soul and perception of the cosmic order is political. It is the organization of society, as in Plato's Republic, and the centrality of the Republic in Plato's work. There is an order in society of three main classes or castes. At the top, there are the priests or philosophers. Then in the middle, there are the warriors and rulers. And at the bottom, there are the workers. And there is a loose association between these three classes or castes and the three orders of impulses. So the priests and philosophers are associated with reason. The warriors and rulers with the action-oriented impulses, and the workers with the sensual appetites. Organize society so that that hierarchy is obeyed, so that the priests and philosophers are in the commanding position, followed by the rulers and warriors who they orient, and then the workers are providing to the material needs. And then there will be order. There will be order simultaneously in the soul, in society, and in the cosmos. Now comes then, in a second moment of this procession, what I'm calling here classical virtue ethics, or eudaimonism. It's an ethics focused on the virtues, the habitual dispositions to the good, and also called eudaimonism. Eudaimonism is from eudaimonia in Greek, happiness or flourishing, the flourishing of the human being. So we abandon this larger project of associating order in the soul with order in the cosmos through the intermediate link of the political scheme. And we focus on a worldly ethic. And you associated in our tradition initially with Aristotle. And to grasp the distinctive character of this ethic, this pagan ethic of virtue, remember the central doctrine of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle's work. Virtue is in the middle. Each virtue is a mean between two extremes. The specific spiritual character of this ethic is even more clearly revealed by the apparently peripheral details in the argument of the Nicomachean Ethics. They seem to be trivial, but they're very telling. I'll give you an example. Aristotle describes the characteristic gait of a magnanimous man. A magnanimous man doesn't walk too slowly, because if he walked too slowly, he would convey the sense of being lost, of being without purpose. And he doesn't walk too hastily, because then he would seem to be anguished and harried. The magnanimous man has a measured and stately pace. That's the view of life in the Nicomachean Ethics. Serenity and self-possession. And it came to be rejected later in the West. Christ was crucified. The Christian is commanded to imitate Christ. So how could we aspire to have a stately and measured gait and to desire this conception of a harmonious, self-possessed personality? It's the denial of the infinite. And all the subsequent contest about the conduct of life has then been a contest among visions that begin in the rejection of this ancient eudaimonism. And I've simply listed here on the board 5 of those positions. They are the first order positions, unlike the meta-ethical theorizing. And all I'm going to do now, in the last 2 minutes of our class, is going to name them. Is going to be to name them. So first, there's Christianity itself, the imitation of Christ, and a view of the moral life in which the pagan virtues of connection, fairness, temperance, courage, prudence, are transformed by the presence of the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And the imitation of Christ's sacrifice. Then comes a second idea of how we should live. I described it here under the label of Romanticism. Self-transformation associated with struggle against society, against conformity, to manifest the infinitude of the self, and manifest in Romantic literature and in any number of thinkers like Emerson or Nietzsche. And it's a different view of how to live. It's not just a meta method. A third position is the religion of humanity, or radical altruism. The term altruism was coined by the French philosopher Auguste Comte. And here I place Bentham as well as Comte, not as an exponent of the supposed meta method, but as what he really was, an advocate of radical altruism. The fourth position is, in some respects, the most characteristic position of the educated and disillusioned elites in the rich North Atlantic societies. It is the privatization of the sublime. So the public world is a world of cold equities and efficiencies, but the sublime, artistic, religious or hedonistic experimentation is all privatized. It's in the realm of the intimate. And that's the highest in life. And this view has had its philosophers, like